Stephen, you've been talking a bit lately about, a continuing bubble in housing, and I think, it's interesting. It's a fascinating story, really, that, it continues. The banks have just so much increased their lending on mortgages, and partly because the non-bank lenders have fallen apart or fallen by the wayside during the GFC, and partly because, the banks have just so cemented their market share in that area. But, Stephen, why is it going to be a housing bubble?
Well, it is a housing bubble right now. I mean, house prices in Melbourne, for instance, and in Sydney are changing hands at 6 times average income. In terms of ratios and world benchmarks, Australian housing is back to being, the most expensive in the world. And if you look at the balance sheets of the big 4 banks, their mortgage books collectively have risen by more than $300 billion in 2 years. So we're supposed to have gone through a financial crisis, and there's a few reasons for that: the collapse of the non-bank lenders, the purchase of Bank West and St George. But in addition to that, our big 4 banks have stacked on many tens of billions of dollars of new loans, which they're sourcing offshore, which is fueling a housing bubble. So people in Melbourne and Sydney are paying, north of $1 million, borrowing $600,000 and $700,000. And that's what I'm saying is completely unsustainable. And that's why I think the Reserve Bank will move decisively on interest rates over the rest of this year, and until they see this crazy housing bubble actually recede to more sensible areas.
All right, just before we talk about interest rates, isn't it partly also fuelled because the big 4 banks are getting, they're the beneficiaries really of savings, people actually depositing money and not spending as much as they were?
Well, to a degree, but don't forget we're still running a current account deficit of $60 to $70 billion a year. So Australia is living beyond its means to that tune, and the way that is financed is big 4 banks borrowing bonds offshore and on passing it to Australian home buyers. I mean, there's no other market in the world where, a big bank like Westpac has 60% of its loan book in mortgages. And there's also no other market in the world where 4 of the top 5 companies are banks. So clearly it is a massively profitable business for the big 4 banks. But what I'm saying is that $1 trillion of mortgages almost now across the big 4, hugely profitable, but that $1 trillion is just unsustainable, and the prices that people are paying, it's just debt fueled. And I can see, have we learnt nothing from the US housing price crashes? I mean, we're just repeating all those mistakes that the rest of the world's just been through.